Welcome to another beautiful sunny morning in Clearwater Bay. As I was telling Dan, this is not typical weather, but we do get some foggy days in early March. And it's been a kind of slow winter this year. It's much longer than usual. Wouldn't you say, Larry? Much longer than usual. Anyway, it gives me great pleasure to invite my good friend and former colleague and still colleague, actually technically I still have an emeritus appointment at Wharton, Daniel Levinthal. And I'm going to start actually with some formal remarks from, this is not his bio, this is the summary, the sort of short form of his talk, but we don't want that. Can you keep the lights on? Who's tinkering with the lights? Yeah. Yeah. I have specially put on my tie. Keep the lights on. Let me start actually with the informal side, since the lights were probably a signal, change your act. So, all right, I'll change it. So Dan and I, it's quite possible, maybe George knows someone longer than I know Dan, but someone in this room. So Dan and I have been friends and colleagues since 1979. That was a long time ago. Now, some of you, there are plenty of young people in this room. This is longer than you have actually lived on this earth. In 1979, fall 79, Dan and I both started as graduate students in beautiful and actually very sunny Palo Alto, California, in the Graduate School of Business. Dan was, at the beginning, much more on the economic side of things. I was much more on the organization side of things. Dan was, at the time, a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed undergrad, fresh from Harvard. I was a little less bright-eyed, a little less bushy-tailed. I had just come from India after an MBA and after about 3 years of work experience. So I was kind of the veteran at that time compared to Dan, who was sort of the great young hope. There's, I think, an interesting photo from the time. From Jacqueline, would you bring up that photo? Now, you'll get points for recognizing who is whom. Those were the days. My very capable executive assistant, Jacqueline, was thinking about the old song from the 70s. Those were the days, my friend. And next slide, please. Now, which one do you think is Dan Levinthal? Difficult to recognize. Next, please, Jacqueline, click next. That's Dan. Now, notice that very beautiful, bushy blonde head of hair. 34 years make a lot of difference. And who is that swarthy young man on the left? Click, please. That's me. And in between, the older gentleman and the lady, those are Jim March and Jane March, our mentors. Jim was both of us, he was our mentor. And this is probably one of the great social scientists, possibly of the last 100 years, certainly of the last 50 to 75 years. He's one of the founders of management theory. And I think we were both very privileged to be not only his students, but really part of his inner circle. And this is Jim's home. And there are some very famous people in this picture. Martha Sue Feldman, right here, who used to be at Michigan and is now at UC Irvine. Dave Anderson with the MIT t-shirt. Alan Romanov behind Dave Anderson. She actually did a PhD with Jim March and then moved into statistics. And I think she was a professor at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, as I recall. So people have moved around. And Omar El Savi from Egypt, he is still at USC at the Marshall School. So this was, I think this picture is from 1982, if I recall. And 82 was a good year for Stanford Business School. After Stanford, I moved to University of Toronto at what is now the Rotman School. Dan moved to GSIA, now the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon. And then myself in 87, Dan in 90, we both ended up at Wharton and in fact have been colleagues ever since until 2014. Let me now just quickly read the formal introduction here. And some of you may know this information, some may not, so it's good for you to know. Dan is currently the Reginald Jones Professor of Corporate Strategy at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He has published extensively on questions of organizational adaptation and industry evolution, particularly in the context of technological change. He's a past winner of the Strategic Management Society's Best Paper Prize and is a fellow of the Strategic Management Society. He's also a fellow of the Academy of Management, to which many of you belong, and has received the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Organization and Management Theory Division of the Academy. The Business Policy and Strategy Division has awarded him the Irvin Educator of the Year Award. Dan could have stopped just with his scholarly contributions and his leadership at Wharton, where he's been Management Department Chair for the last 12 years. And I might mention, please don't be embarrassed, Dan, that in that period, according to University of Texas at Dallas, citations of papers published in top management journals, when you partition out the management journals, the Department of Management under Dan's leadership, without any change, has been #1 in the entire world. He could have stopped with his scholarly contributions and his leadership, but he's been a wonderful leader in the world of academic journals. He used to be editor-in-chief of Organization Science, one of the top journals in management, and he stepped down from that. Earlier, he was editor for the business strategy side at Management Science, another top journal, and he's currently launched, I think the first issue just came out, editor-in-chief of Strategy Science, which is one of the newest journals coming out of the Org Science group. And so very good reasons for you to actually know him and to be in his network. And I've invited Dan to see if more of our faculty can be involved in the editorial process. He has received an honorary doctorate from the University of Southern Denmark and the University of Tilburg, and has held visiting professorships at the Harvard Business School, Sant Anna School of Advanced Studies in Italy, right? And University of New South Wales in Australia, and Lewis, L-U-I-S-S. Where's that? Rome. Okay, all right. I'm sure I know the name of the university, but not the acronym. So next slide, please. One of the, this is just a personal word, which again, even in long-lived relationships, sometimes we don't get enough time to express to each other. One of the things I've always admired about Dan's work is he's a very, very rigorous, deep theorist. Some of my own work has really aspired to do that kind of, to hold to that kind of standard. But what I have always loved, those of you that know me in my dean's role, I've been stressing rigor and relevance. Virtually all of Dan's questions are very deeply connected, though in an abstract way, to very, very relevant real-world problems. And I've always loved that, this balance of rigor and relevance. Would you click the Google Scholar citation slide? This again, Dan, please don't be embarrassed. Dan has done some exceptional work, and I know some of you question the importance of citations, but he has published one paper in 1990 in Administrative Science Quarterly, and that has had, since its publication, 28,667 citations. There are not too many people in the entire world who can claim to have written even one paper that actually goes above something like, above 1,000 is already a very high standard, about 5 to 10,000 is exceptional. 20, 25,000, you're talking about Albert Einstein's papers, some of them were cited 100,000 times, but one might argue that those papers were published in 1904 and 1918, so who knows where Dan's papers will be 50, 70 years from now. So lots of stuff about Dan, and the one way to frame his talk, and he's been very, very generous in adapting to our needs as an institution, not only in the business school, but in fact as a whole university. I'm co-chairing a committee for the cluster hiring in design thinking and entrepreneurship. And since Dan's work is very relevant to issues of innovation and entrepreneurship, I said to him, would you talk more about that? Give us a broad survey as well and locate your work on that landscape. And Dan has been very kind. And what he's planned to do, he'll speak for about an hour or so. And please feel free to stop him along the way. We have taught Wharton MBAs. We are accustomed to this, being stopped all the time. He'll save maybe 10 minutes at the end for questions, but take questions as he goes along. Dan, welcome, and please give him a hand.
Thanks so much for that very kind, somewhat daunting introduction. So I have at least tried to partially adapt to the agenda Jitendra set for me, and somewhat in the spirit of his, and there's only one slide, kind of, one approaches issues from one's own history, context, perspective. So Jitendra asked me to reflect a little bit on issues of innovation, entrepreneurship, and per this triangle, I kind of have, three sort of roots in thinking about that. So formally, doctorate in economics. We both have our imprinting from that seductive-looking gentleman over there, Jim March. But really, my primary identity for much of this time has been as a business strategy scholar. And these three lenses, sort of as starting points, I think give kind of somewhat different perspective on the challenge of innovation. Economists, basically, it's about incentives in various flavors, and I'll talk in a bit. The strategy literature more focused on firms are different. These heterogeneous capabilities, sort of a founding kind of orientation perspective. I think as organization theorists, part of what that brings to the table is appreciation of context. For me, context is primarily the organization itself, but I want to spend a little time thinking about the broader social context as well that I think is important in framing the innovative process. So, just very briefly, from an economist lens, it's really, this is the incentives and in particular, the possibility of achieving some sort of ex post quasi-monopoly position. Certainly the patent regime is set up to do that. There's a lot of discourse about patents, appropriate patenting. This is not a new social issue. The Doges in Venice in the 1450 created a systematic patent system because they were interested in cultivating leading glasswork and wanted that both the incentives and some degree of appropriability around it. Actually, their 10-year patent policy doesn't come too far off of what the U.S. a few hundred years later decided was a good patent regime. So this tension of, and furthermore, the issue of to what degree to product market competition prompt innovative efforts as firms try to escape that product market competition with innovative products. So important, fairly well-developed body of work. As I noted, in the strategy world, the issue tends to be about capabilities, and in particular, interest and concern how disruptive change. So a lot of energy about the historical path-dependent nature of capability development. In the current discourse, a lot of discussion about what have been termed dynamic capabilities, the idea that there may be enduring basis for these firm attributes that facilitate, enable change. And I want to speak to that a little bit later in my remarks. But really what I want to primarily think about is context. Okay? And as I said, most of my energy, I'll talk some about some of my own work that thinks about the organization as a context, but I want to broaden it up a bit at the outset. And so as I've kind of in my kind of triad here, to think about context in the sense of the markets in which firms operate, not just product markets, but the market for capital and labor, but also the broader social structure in which firms operate and how that may impact. And to illuminate that, I'm going to give you a very quick, and truly very quick, suggestive, maybe slightly bastardized interpretation of some really important elements of innovative business history that I think can kind of help highlight these mechanisms. So in brief, okay, the critical innovations underlying the sort of modern economy of mass production. And I'm drawing here from David Hounshild's really wonderful book that talks about the development of this technical system, and kind of in parallel, Chandler's discussion about the organizational structures that kind of arose to support those kind of enterprises. And what I want to just suggest is, yeah, surely they're enabling scientific engineering technologies. The art and the sort of folk wisdom of this important historical event, we tend to think about Henry Ford and the development of mass production in that context. Preceding Ford, there were sort of similar changes if you looked at the development of sewing machines, you looked at the bicycle industry, but underlying that was the development of a machine tool. Actually, George, we were just talking about the role of the military. The military had an armaments industry that they developed that helped facilitate boring machines that ultimately became a more general purpose technology called a machine tool. And actually that drift from highly specialized equipment, solving the problem of water in mines in Britain, becoming the steam engine. So it's quite common occurrence of very specialized problems, and whose specialized problems society cares about? People who have money and resources to solve it, which historically has been the government and the military. And solving their problems, though, in some cases might generalize. But clearly, critical part is you're not doing large-scale volume manufacturing unless you have a large market of potential buyers. Okay, part of that societal context. That's why this is happening, important reason why it's happening in the US, which at that time globally had the large middle class. There are people you're going to sell these products into, and as Chandler makes clear, the development of the railroad for that physical logistics system, and the telegraph that actually can coordinate a large disparate organization. So these kind of elements are coming together, large-scale production systems. And you think about labor markets, particularly, from the Wharton point of view. So Wharton is the first business school in 1880s or so. I should know the precise date, but 83, thank you. Time is not accident, okay? You have these organizations of tremendous scale and scope. Going beyond the owner-management firm, you need this new labor, professional management, and schools to help produce them. These firms are no longer bootstrapping themselves. They need to tap into capital markets. But the legal broader structure matters a lot as well, right? So corporate bond market cannot exist unless you have a legal structure that says firms actually are entities that can be sued and be held liable. Okay, so you have this kind of parallel social structure that is allowing the financing to emerge for these kind of enterprises. And even more culturally, management as a profession, corporations as a legitimate institutions emerging as well. Okay, so this is really a kind of critical element in kind of our modern economy. We want to think about, but if we typically think of that's a process innovation in some sense, mass manufacturing. We typically are more conventionally thinking about more direct science-based innovation. And it seems to me, arguably, from a kind of business side, the really first breakthrough and kind of transformative one is the development of the dye industry, particularly in the context of Germany. Okay, so here you had science-led innovation, breakthroughs in organic chemistry that are going to commercialize, and jumping to the sort of legal or the cultural. There's a parallel scientific development happening in Britain, but the commercialization didn't happen there. And I would argue, and sort of Peter Merman I'm drawing on here, the cultural divide between British academy and industry was rather dramatic. And so in the German context, both the universities were more open to the idea of the commercialization, having their bright PhDs and postdoc go off to industry, and industry also was in turn open and created really the first industrial R&D labs. So that becomes a kind of bridge between what's happening in leading German universities and what can get developed commercially inside these corporations. So you have the development of industrial R&D. with various innovations, patent law has to often adapt. Okay, so my next slide on, the DNA, patent law set aside, a protein synthetically created is patentable. In the modern era, patent law set aside, what elements of software are potentially patentable kinds of breakthroughs. But with, this, I think, is the development of kind of the modern R&D based organization and happening in a specific context, I think, for these kinds of reasons. But that's not our did something bad to this device. That we can use. Oops. I did something on the side. Is that what? Is there somebody's? Okay. Thank you. But yeah, I did note that my fingers wandered and maybe did something very bad. Oh, wow. That was a very good diagnosis. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. You're right. Okay. So keeping to the life science or the science basic kind of going from organic chemistry and biochemistry. So Stanley Cohen, kind of a Bay Area story, and Henry Boyer, guess who's the Berkeley guy, right? So the sort of bigger hair, bigger mustache. But he gets two pictures because not only is there the Cohen-Boyer important patent and breakthrough in recombinant in DNA, but Boyer goes off and starts a firm, Genentech. So Cohen stays as the proper scientist. Boyer goes off and kind of takes these ideas to industry. But what I think this is an interesting, I kind of picked this as I think it has a nice contrast with the German dye story. Okay, yes, they're both science. The social organization of biotech is a radical breakthrough. Right? And in particular, this is not happening inside the established pharma reasons, partly for the reasons strategy people would say. It's a very different science base. Those firms have been developed using organic chemistry. They hadn't been, their scientists hadn't been trained in these new methods. But that's not quite enough, okay? I mean, it's also, again, we have this spin out from university. Culturally, this is A-OK, okay? This is, and also the affording infrastructure. It's happening in Silicon Valley. So before Cohen and Boyer come up with this innovation, 15 years ago, there's Fairchild Semiconductor. There's Intel. In the early 60s, late 50s, there's Hewlett-Packard. Okay, the dean of the engineering school, and then their president Terman is encouraging these young guys, Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard, to go out and start a firm. So the venture firms got started in a silicon kind of world, but they're very ready in a kind of general purpose affordance to help the life science industry get going in a venture-backed way. And these, again, are really special kind of firms because the traditional silicon firms were developed to create products. These guys become, Genentech scales up and becomes a kind of a fully vertically established firm, but a lot of enterprises basically becoming specialized R&D shops. That's possible because of the venture money that's willing to support it and the broader stock market. It's possible because of a legal structure that says this product can actually be licensed, and there's a market for intellectual property. You don't have to go to direct commercialization. You can license with established pharma and have a pretty happy life as this focused firm. Yeah, Jitendra.
Just a quick footnote to what you're saying, Dan. You made the point earlier about intellectual property, and one might argue in the life sciences, some of the most important work in the last 25, 30 years, and possibly in the next 50 years or more, will come out of biotech and related technologies. The Supreme Court decision that makes recombinant DNA-based products patentable, right? It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, was a close decision, as I recall. It could have gone the other way, and this industry may never have developed, or it may have developed somewhere else.
Well, or developed in a different form, and that is, in some sense, established pharma would have played I think, an earlier and even bigger role, right? So that the firms that can ultimately commercialize and take it to market would have to be responsible for this because you wouldn't be able to kind of insulate yourself. And I think biotech is pretty, it's unusual in that regard because of this kind of ruling. In most spheres, appropriability happens through taking products to market more quickly than your competitors. Because I'm sort of, and I think it's important to kind of counterbalance. I'm highlighting the legal structure here, but more typically in industries, the virtues of being early is being to market early, as opposed to having this kind of explicit kind of property right. This is unusual context that allowed these guys to be boutique R&D firms. You don't see, boutique firms creating, the software-based enterprises go all the way to commercialization. They don't say, I'm Uber and I have an idea, I'm going to license this to somebody else. They're going to roll it out. So we see a kind of new innovative form. And again, if the established VC industry wasn't already there, this would have been much more problematic. Right? So there's a kind of broader ecosystem.
I would say one of the distinctions that I saw during this was, in fact, the economic potential of the biotechnology is extremely large in the sense that the tool you develop to solve a particular problem is also a tool that could be used for many other problems. So the VC and the pharma companies are willing to sponsor people to develop that technology because they know it's going to be very, very broadly applicable in the long run. And so not only is it going to be extremely valuable for a particular product, but it's a tool. It's like developing machine tools.
Exactly.
So there's a case I know of where money was put in to develop a cheap drug for treating. It's a disease in Africa that people get in Africa from mosquitoes, malaria. Right, malaria. Westerners can afford the drugs, but the locals can't. So, genetically modifying bacteria to make stuff that this rare plant makes, right? Developing that tool to take out those genes and put them in. And eventually CRISPR, right, which is extremely valuable tool, right? The big fight is developing now who owns CRISPR because it's a tool that everybody's going to use. Right?
Yeah. And I think, again, that's really important. And back to this idea of general purpose technologies. I mean, the big breakthroughs, whether, the machine tool, computation, and again, think about, the computer, actually at University of Pennsylvania story, the first computer is developed to solve the military's problem of quickly figuring out the trigonometry problem of the arc of artillery shell. It was a very, very specialized piece of equipment. They're not creating the UNIAC because, oh my God, we can transform businesses and soon we can have cool devices in our pocket that tell us where the restaurant is. So it's an incredibly specialized purpose for the military that turns out to have this broad applicability. And certainly, Cohen and Boyer are thinking about very, very foundationally, we do a specific application, but it's really the engineering techniques that are being developed that have this enormous, and that's why they're incredible breakthroughs. I think some of my other work kind of points to that if you're the entrepreneur, part of what you're trying to do is find market niches that can support the early application of that kind of tool. So there may become a day when this is going to happen, but in a more near-term sense, you need to validate and create an earning stream. And so, picking out what piece of the market might adapt, or creatively, I've done some other work. I did a piece on looking at the development of wireless technology, and from its beginning, from kind of Hertz using that as a piece of lab equipment to the modern age. And so, for instance, the transformation of Hertz Marconi is really a wonderful kind of story in this regard. And so Hertz creates a piece of lab equipment. Marconi's not formally a scientist. He sees how this could be useful in contexts where wired telegraphy is not a possibility. His mom has a connection to the British Admiralty. He takes it to them and he kind of explains it. Once again, the military, this is a good idea. And when I was doing this work, I found this lovely memoir by this guy, George Lodge, who was a very eminent scientist who would give these talks explaining Hertzian waves, he was testing Maxwell's theories, and in his talks, he would demonstrate setting up a wireless telegraphy in the lecture room, just as kind of this how it works. And so he wrote his memoir, he goes, it never occurred to me it'd be any worthwhile doing with difficulty what you can do with ease, that telegraphy. He wasn't thinking of that special application of things called ships and islands that the British Admiralty cared about. Marconi takes that stuff and it becomes very different. And he has to transform wireless signal all across the North Atlantic for his purposes. But it was really a shift in a realization of a different application domain that was really quite the initial breakthrough. Okay, so we have this kind of, again, back to this point of the context in which that innovation happens is really terribly important. What I want to focus on, where most of my work is thinking about the organization itself as a context, particularly thinking about these ideas of evolutionary dynamics, adaptation within the organization. So before one does that, it's perhaps a reasonable question to consider, okay, well, how awesome are organizations at kind of being innovative? This is not a statement about being innovative, but it's a kind of corollary, perhaps. This is a statement about their likely longevity. So this is old data. Things haven't gotten more stable and fixed since 1997. So this is Dick Foster and Sarah Kaplan in a nice early book on innovative systems, saying, look, the established enterprises, 57, the 500 dominant firms, it gets smaller. Interestingly, the story's even worse if you thought about rate of return. That is, even if you could pick the survivors, you would have done better just owning the S&P 500. Now, think about, though, carefully what that contrast means. Because if you own the S&P 500, that means every January 1, you're rebalancing your portfolio because some firms exited and some entered. You're renewing your investment versus hanging on to even those survivors. Now, from a strategy point of view, this is bad news. If you only hired the right consultant, they would give you immortality, because the quest of immortality and sustained competitive advantage sort of seems to be a kind of implicit agenda for the strategy field. But maybe, is it a pathology, or is this a kind of positive trace empirical indicator of a healthy system? This is what Schumpeterian dynamics are supposed to look like. Things fail, new things arise, capital, labor, energy gets freed up and gets reallocated. Okay, so the level of analysis is really critical. From the firm point of view, this is kind of bad news. They didn't have the right CEO, they didn't hire the right consultant, didn't read the right guru's book. It's not so obvious from a broader system point of view, whether this is pathology or a trace indicator. I've seen versions of this data for Europe, and you don't have that same drop off, but you don't have the same level of innovativeness. So again, kind of bug or feature, to use a software language. Now, even if one views it as a kind of healthy indicator of Schumpeterian dynamics, it's important to kind of think about some other these are not costless reallocations. Think about the level of anger in the United States currently, having to deal with the shifting of the global focus of manufacturing. So yes, on net, these may be positive, but certainly can be very disruptive in lots of ways. Even narrowly, as a kind of strategy person who thinks about issues of organizational capabilities, it's not just individuals that get reallocated. There really may be lots of tacit knowledge that get lost when these entities with their demise. And there may be some subtle externalities. In the global financial collapse, there was some interesting discussion in the U.S. context about the automobile industry. So why should the government come in and support and bail out General Motors? And certainly, I think most of the energy was on this first bullet. But there was some, our former colleague John Paul McDuffie, some interesting discussion per the third bullet. That is, if General Motors were to fail, it would have such a devastating effect on the supply chain even though Ford currently was pretty healthy and doing well in product markets, Ford might ultimately fail because the suppliers would be jointly affected, right? So there are some kind of broader, complex interdependencies one wants to be mindful of. But I think I still take this kind of Foster and Kaplan say, oh, this is a failure, you haven't read our book yet. And there's some element of truth to that. But I don't think a population of firms that live forever is what a society necessarily should aspire for. Okay, so there clearly is some level of tension between healthy renewal levels at one level analysis versus doing the right thing, trying to be foresighted at the individual firm level. Back to your MOOCs, huh? You're gonna so universe, right? So, and I want to think about this at both levels. Okay, so there's the population of universities and perhaps birth, death. Also, bear in mind, in the non-biological context, not just birth, death, but changing scale is really important, right? And so, elephants are big, but they don't actually get any bigger. Okay, business firms, Walmart is a really big elephant, and it wasn't always such a big elephant. So part of it's also important to bear in mind in the business context, this differential selection isn't just the actual entity, but enormous differential kind of growth rates. And so, but back to universities, actually, universities do die. Michael Kratz and Ed Zajac did some early work. We think about them as infinitely lived. They merge, they die. I mean, you're seeing certainly U.S. Small liberal arts schools. I'm not making a normative statement. That's a good thing for society. But some of them are closing. There can be mergers, and there's some. I think the other issue, the universities have the same. But even within the universities, do academic departments live forever? Do we scale up, or do we create a new thing called biochemistry and so on? And so this kind of part of my own work tries to take this sensibility inside the entities. But the point, I think, back to the, well taken from a social point of view, freeing up resources can be a good thing even in the university role. And there can be some of these same issues of loss and pain and transition are present. We need it at both levels, within those organizations and through differential growth and maybe even selection at the population level, but that has a fair amount of pain.
Universities, or for that matter, different kinds of religious orders, are classic examples of what, on the organizational sociology side, we call institutionalized organizations. And they are subject to different kinds of selection pressures, or in some ways they are insulated from selection pressures. And hence they are a special kind of organization. That explains in part how they live so long. Even so, you're quite right that in many market-oriented economies, because of pressures from students not wanting to enroll anymore, some universities are going out of business.
And it's worth noting.
Continue to disrupt this. The reason I bring it up is first because we're in universities, but second of all, we think of them as business, as business management has gone forward, that technological innovation, that is the transfer of knowledge and new results out to industry, makes a bigger and bigger difference. There's certainly a reason HKUST was created, because there was already a couple of universities, 3 universities here in Hong Kong that I know about, and so why would you need HKUST, right?
Not the love examiner, not to say exactly, as we were thinking, okay, we're in a entity that didn't exist in 1990, okay? It's a pretty serious entity here in 2016, so that's a pretty radical transformation, and George's point is really interesting, is if you're the Hong Kong authority, right, organizations can have a fair degree they have both capabilities, and the flip side of that is inertia. So if you wanted to create a kind of more science, technology-oriented effort within the ecosystem of Hong Kong, perhaps it was an easier thing to create HKUST than to get one of the existing entities to change. And you might resources are finite. So what does that mean? You're going to be taking some resources that the government might otherwise have been allocating to some of the traditional entities and bringing them over to this part of the island or mainland. So clearly there is, interesting dynamics just here. And that's, from zero to this is pretty, I have to say my visit, pretty striking to think. We were just joking before my talk. It's like, oh my God, really? I didn't realize. I took it as a taken for granted fact. I thought the Brits created this thing, in ancient days. And like, oh my God, 1991, really?
Thank God for the Jockey Club.
It's not only the example of universities which we are all used to living in, but it's the fact that universities are playing a much bigger role in an innovative society.
Yeah.
Innovation is so critical to people.
But that goes exactly back to why I kind of the ancient, the great German universities of the 1880s in the dye industry, synthetic dye, or the more contemporary U.S. context, right? Back in the old monopoly days of AT&T and Bell Labs, corporates did actually serious basic research to a first-order approximation that doesn't exist. So it's going to happen in a university context, and also a university's context that's much more open to commercial possibilities than in previous eras.
But see, here in Hong Kong, they're very open to it. In the U.S., it's in transition where you let university research go out to industry, whereas 25 years ago, the university retained the intellectual property, and maybe would license, maybe not, right?
Well, and that's why actually I referenced the Bayh-Dole Act was really quite important in that regard, right? Exactly. In particular, so the government wrote the check. It wasn't obvious that the universities get to have the intellectual property rights and the royalty stream for, Cohen and Boyer, I got to believe that was NIH money. So why did Stanford and UCF get so rich off that royalty stream and Cohen and Boyer? So that was part of what that legal kind of effort did, which then in turn universities, this is kind of interesting. Let's have technology licensing offices. This is a serious revenue generator for us. So kind of working out who gets the benefit was really quite important. And again, given these are off government grants, a priori, not completely obvious it had to end up that way, but they clarified the rules that gave both the university and those individuals the rights. And I also think actually that issue of kind of social stigma or something that, the current president, incoming president of Stanford University spent a good chunk of their professional career in industry, and that didn't taint them, okay? They didn't lose status and legitimacy. So the soft side of that as well. But back there, so yes, we need to be renewed, and it's important, I think, and basically you're getting to my kind of punchline, is to think about it at both levels, at the broader societal population level, but also if an organization is going to be healthy, to think about it within the organization. So back to the broader, so these organizations, a lot of them fail, but maybe they're a fountain of innovation. So if you think about spin-outs, not spin-offs. Spin-off is the firm sells off a division. Our Rashri Agarwal nicely tries to distinguish a spin-out is bright young people or managers walk with ideas, okay? Fairchild becomes an incubator of Intel because more noise get frustrated with what's going on in Fairchild. So, and people have done some interesting work back to the market context. So within the U.S., different states have different laws about non-compete and how restrictive it is about what you can do when you walk out the door. Massachusetts, California, Michigan have somewhat different laws. And people have done some pretty careful empirical work to actually imply that the level of patenting, the level of innovative is in fact impact. If you're going to tether people to the firm because they can't, without the threat of lawsuit, do interesting things in that same context, the evidence suggests you're dialing back the level of innovativeness in those contexts. And when you walk out, is there somebody to write you a check? Back to cultural norms. Now I am speaking without any social science knowledge, highly newspaper level impressionism. But my newspaper level impressionism, if I contrast, say, Japan and the US, Japan is a very outstanding science-based kind of university system, technology, strong science base in its industry, but a relatively modest level of entrepreneurship, conditional on those factors. And my uninformed or mildly informed hunch is to be innovative and to be particularly be an entrepreneur is failure is a likely outcome, more likely than success. And apart from the financial payoffs and considerations, is there a social stigma around failure? In Silicon Valley, I think part of the magic of Silicon Valley is they do failure really well. It's like, oh yeah, it didn't work out, kind of learned some stuff. Now I'm going to get off Bayshore Highway at a different exit. It's not all that consequential. Those stock options, I'll put them up on my wall. If it's shame at a deep personal level, that's going to lead to some level of caution. And so I think that's part of that broader social context. It's also, most innovations are not, just this one-off thing. They need complementary resource capability. They're part of a broader business system. So then the question is, if you're, how, there's the incentive issues, but then beyond that, how effectively can you marshal those necessary resources, complementary resources, and capability? Historically, that's what organizations, established firms could do, potentially. It's all there. They have distribution. They have people who can help. I think what we've seen over the years, first in financing, but now in broader kind of actual systems, it's easier and easier to kind of take it and go and use the sort of what that ecosystem can provide, a non-organizational ecosystem, right? So the financing's there, and particularly in the current context, cloud computing. It makes this infrastructure a variable cost. I don't have to make any commitments. It's completely scalable. It's made those, easy to become, why not see if I can be Airbnb, Uber, what have you. The level of investments up front have gotten very modest in this context. So again, the challenge is still the same. How do you marshal the necessary resources and capability? But the way they can be marshaled, I think, has changed in the last, has continued to change last decade or two. Right. So that's, but back to this idea that we've begun to chat about already is this. Is it? That's me as Jitendra kind of, me as the kind of theorist of these adaptive systems. So there's learning at a given level. Okay, I as a human being have figured out some things in my life. I'm the mouse in the tea maze. I'm deciding to go left or right. Some prior history of getting water, sugar, cheese has influenced that and my pattern of behavior. Okay, that's learning, and lots of management literature has focused on that. Actually, some of Jitendra's early work as this kind of theme and orientation, and actually in some ways I think the field unfortunately moved away from that orientation. I'm trying to push back a bit, is, to bring this population sensibility within the organization, to think about adaptation through this differential selection within the organization as a basis for change. And so that's a very different kind of change than figuring out to go left or right, learning at a level, actor level. So, we think about nested systems. We think about, okay, there's this world, there's niche, there's selection pressure. We got organizations, maybe they interact with each other. Again, what I'm focusing on more is to recognize organization itself is a population of initiatives. And in some ways, potentially, this is kind of where the larger firm, it can afford to engage in parallelism. A new enterprise can only do one thing. It has to get that product to market. But I don't. My sense is organizations maybe not as effective as they might be is about exploiting this latent parallelism. So that leads us to this important management theorist, Charles Darwin, okay, and what he might have to offer contemporary management thought in that light, and in the modern management literature, but really set up by John Holland in his early work on complex adaptive systems. Is this important idea of this tension between systems need to survive in the moment, they need to eat, Businesses need to write checks for their employees and pay off their debts. But they need to explore and look for other potential means of making their way in the world. Partly the problems they face are hard. From John Holland's point of view, hard means NP complete. Nobody's going to have an optimal strategy in Go, even though the computer just beat a human being, an expert. It's still not solving for the optimum. And the world, inconveniently or not, changes. So it's another reason why this continual exploration is important. So how does one balance it, or what does that mean in a business context? Are we throwing money in R&D, new product development? Are we refining our existing products, pushing down costs on them? And at all levels of the system. Am I investing in these people? Are we focusing on some immediate task? And the currency, monetary currency. I think time, energy, and attention, though, arguably is even, you can go to capital markets and get more money. Top management has only kind of a finite bandwidth and these other latent kind of resources. How do we allocate them? And I just want to talk briefly about work I've done over some period of time, so some older work and some new work, that in various ways tries to speak to some of the tensions and challenges in managing this kind of balance within an organization. So some early work with Jim March. So learning's supposed to be adaptive, and it kind of is, but Jim and I point out there are ways in which it's going to reinforce myopia. Because, when you try new things, the odds are, A, it's not as good as what you've already figured out, was a good thing to do in the past. And secondly, you're not as skillful in doing it. Okay, so the near-term impact from novelty is likely to be negative. So we talk about this idea of the competence trap. Similarly, the benefits of exploring are likely to be more distant in time. So what's the feedback I get? A feedback is a quarterly report. Taking money and resources in R&D is going to make that quarterly report, otherwise, other things being equal, look bad. So all the kind of feedback mechanisms are going to suggest tilt the needle a little bit more towards exploit. I should note, I did this some time ago. After the financial collapse of 2008, I thought about, perhaps I should have written a kind of reprise, okay? Because one of my aha for me, a narrow, idiosyncratic aha, in thinking about these issues in the context of the financial collapse. So here's the story, Jim and I, okay, all these investments, the feedback system will drive you to exploit. Imagine I'm a financial engineer. And my choice is, do I take more or less risk? So I'm kind of leveraged. I took some moderately dodgy, but pretty much okay mortgages, made some money. How about if I leverage up a bit more, take slightly dodgier mortgage? Oh, guess what? Next year I even made more money. That's pretty awesome. So what occurred to me is in finance, the liabilities are distant in time. The payoff is near in time. So even if I just put away, there's lots of stories going on there. But if I just thought about it as a simple adaptive learning system, it actually is quite predictable train wreck. And actually we saw this in the leveraged buyout boom in the US, where people had norms about what was an okay leverage ratio, and that ratio kept on rising and rising over time until the thing collapsed. So in the sort of real economy, I think this was a problem. In the world of finance, actually, arguably the problem is feedback causes you to if explore means take on more risk, actually has the opposite implication until the whole house of cards falls down. And the management literature and the strategy literature, one important line of argument, a way to kind of rationalize these considerations, is to adapt from finance this idea of real options. So option, you make some initial investment, you have the right to exercise it down the road, and people got, I think at some level appropriately, very excited. Oh, that's like our problem. Here's a little R&D, little initial product development. The real expenses are, do I commercialize? So it was a way to think in a rational manner about these uncertain environments. And I think has a lot of merit, but in my kind of curmudgeonly viewpoint maybe on things, or trying to push things back a little bit, is I felt that people had adopted a kind of cartoon or had treated real options in organizations on technology investments as being more isomorphic to the finance model than was appropriate. In finance, you turn on your computer and you look at, are you in the money or not? There's no ambiguity. And everybody sees it. I don't have to pay any cost for that information. It's transparent to all. In a firm, if what we're talking about is, I'm taking an option on, at a fundamental level, something like biotech, at a narrow level, a country market, or a particular new product, do I exercise? Well, typically the information is ambiguous. It kind of worked, people sort of liked it, they didn't quite like it, maybe if we try a different market, maybe if we fine-tune the functionality, the next iteration will work. Are you in the money or not is typically not a clear element. And as Ron and I push on at a conceptual level, say, you got to distinguish between things that are exogenous to the actors in the system and things that are endogenous. Right? So if you're investing in foreign plants because you want to hedge currency risk, the currency markets aren't changing because you built your plant in these different countries. And then you've created this optionality about where you might want to produce. If the issue is this product development effort worth scaling up? Well, maybe if our people worked harder. Maybe if they were more clever. So it's endogenous to the choices. Some of it's exogenous, these unpredictable kind of uncertainties. Ron and I know, look, it's an option when you got something else to do. Okay? We just say, if you're high up and we say, yeah, we got one team, the alpha team doing this, the beta team doing this. We'll see what happens. We'll scale up one of those. Okay, that seems like an option. You're running these experiments. For the person who's the manager of the alpha team or the beta team, this is their career. That's not an option. Their job is to make that succeed, and they're not going to look so great if it doesn't. So back to this, in some ways, how do you manage failure? How do we evaluate whether we do it? And on one hand, you can't be too soft. Everybody gets a trophy, even if your team didn't work, because you want to keep the incentives up. But if you get too draconian, people are going to really work hard. And what you see in companies, they talk about these, somewhat like the university examples, but inside the corporate context, zombies. These initiatives that never die because, it's kind of painful. And we told, Bob and Sally worked so hard and they really cared and their heart's in this thing. We want to make them feel bad. And maybe if we keep on putting on resources, something's going to happen. So the point is, at some broad conceptual level, the optionality is a really important insight. Making it meaningful in an organization about, basically, in my view, it's how you manage experiments. And again, experiments where you have lots of complicated incentives, motivations around it. So, I think it's important ways we try to problematize how this approach can be used. Somewhat in that vein, more generally, this is all, or sort of this issue I'm terming here. How do you select in the interim? So, yes, I like evolutionary ideas. Maybe a little bit crazy, though our friend Sid Winter, imagine there is something called a DNA organization. There's a genetic basis. Let's forget whether that's useful or not. Assume that's a useful starting point. What I think people have vastly neglected is development. Okay? The gene can be constant. The expression of it changes, which in turn says it kind of matters when we do the selection. Human beings don't come out of the gate all that awesome. We'd get selected out pretty quickly if there wasn't this kind of broader thing called a family unit buffering cute little rambling babies and toddlers for potential selection environments. It's not inherent that we're going to have these tremendous biceps, okay? What was the nature of the care, feeding, nutrition, and so on? So from the same gene, there's enormous range of phenotypic variation that could happen. And we've, again, in management, when we've adopted that analogy, I think have largely neglected those really two fundamental issues. So fine, let's pretend there's the DNA of the corporation. People buy a smartphone because they think it's a cool smartphone. They don't think, oh yeah, I think Apple has awesome DNA. They think Apple has nice laptops and smartphones. And even financial markets, they're forward-looking, but it can only be conditional on observables. Right? They're not doing DNA testing on these corporations. So, in a kind of parallel to my early work with Jim, Hart Posen and I talk about the myopia of selection. So, if you look in that upper right, a lot of studies of learning, particularly the modeling literature, tends to look at asymptotic properties. Well, we don't always get to live to the asymptote. Okay, life intervenes. So, yes, in the limit, that red line and the strategy underlying that may be preferred, but will that happen? When is selection occurring? When is it strongest? And it seems to me this is absolutely central for the innovative context. Because those are the entities least buffered from selection pressure, and secondly, they're the entities that are most plastic, for whom their ultimate phenotype is least clear from what's happening early on in that point. And so I think we really, to attend in a very careful way about how the nature of the strategy, the endowment, the buffering, and in some sense, that's what VCs try to do. That's why they have stage financing. They don't say, here's the money, go forth. But how they gate that, I think, is a really interesting issue. I have a former PhD student, Ishan Guler, from around this time, and Ishan looked at VCs, and we take the normal, why is a VC successful? Well, there's two obvious reasons. One is, okay, Kleiner Perkins or somebody gets the great deals. Second, more self-enhancing reason is they actually have some capabilities. It also may be true. There's a third thing, which Ishan points to drawing on this work, which is some of them know when to turn off the faucet. Okay? You have a fund. There's $100 million. There's a high degree of randomness. If I have the discipline to turn the faucet off on round 2 when things aren't going well, I get a new draw from the urn. If I don't do that, I hang on and I've tapped out my capital during that whole period. And so she found, in general, firms were re-upping in ways that baseline probabilities would seem very problematic. Okay, you need a third or fourth round of financing. The conditional probability of ever getting an IPO or being bought out is really low. Okay, and yet the VCs who, and we kind of looked at it, this is where it's both most critical, and empirically we can actually see what's going on, but these are the guys who should do it. I mean, it's easier to turn off the faucet on a venture company than one of your own divisions. You're not eating lunch with these guys every day. But even there, firms struggle, and she found some evidence that the VC firms that are better able at recycling their resources, that third element of not going for round 3 or 4, did have higher rates of return. They got a new draw from the urn. So, this issue kind of is really, I think, quite important. Now, kind of the last bit I want to lay out is some recent work Alessandro Marino and I have done, which tries to speak to this question and interest in the management field about, quote, dynamic capabilities. And so part of my concern about some of that literature is ultimately organization adaptation is a property of the aggregate. And I think it's can be very problematic to try to identify a particular feature as the source of adaptation. Indeed, if you think about Jim March's early work along these lines, in Jim's model of exploration and exploitation, rapid individual learning at a certain point becomes dysfunctional with the organization. It drove out the heterogeneity. So it's not an easy thing to go from individual level properties in a complex adaptive system to how that overall system is going to behave. And in particular, Alessandro and I say, yeah, it seems not, and so we treated it, as a model in an abstract way. Issue of plasticity. Okay, it seems kind of neat. You can be flexible. That's great. But we point out two kind of negatives. One is a sort of concern that, say, Nelson and Winter would have noted about reliability. Replication of a well-established practice is actually kind of useful. The other is selectability. So imagine you have a manager, and they did this foreign entry strategy, and you said, just go there, go to Brazil, figure it out. They go, And it turns out great. Okay, I could select that individual, maybe hope they could replicate else, but I have no practices that I could then go off with another manager. I've given them so much plasticity that underlying set of behaviors are not allowing themselves to be selected. So Alison and I kind of explore the sort of boundaries around when this plasticity is in fact useful and when, in some sense, this selection of over relatively stable properties is a more attractive way for the system to adapt. So again, really pushing the population properties as central. Okay. One more last one, right? Should have been looking here in my outline. Okay, the final, so what is exploration? You know, it's pretty clear as a kind of theorist what we might mean there, but it's, I think, pretty clear what it doesn't mean, okay? So exploration is not sitting at the beach waiting for random ideation to happen. You're doing something. Now, in the empirical literature, the way we primarily treated it is you're trying something new. A new customer, new technology, and so on. And clearly there's a lot of merit to that. What Ron and I want to suggested is that's about context, what urns I go shopping in. Another kind of exploration, another way to think about it is your criteria by what you judge good performance is different. That's novel. So Ron channeled this kind of, he introduced me to this lovely parable called Flatland. So there's this world, it's two-dimensional, and somebody comes in from the three-dimensional world and says, oh yeah, there's this other dimension, and they think that individual's crazy. Now, bear in mind, using another iconic, more famous piece of literature, Don Quixote, sometimes novel may be, in fact, crazy, okay? That's not a dragon, that's a windmill, okay? And Don Quixote's being a little delusional there. So a novel dimension of performance, that's exploration, and then in some sense it's a bet on is that interesting. I think that's also part of my sense, maybe it's kind of a bit of a aside, but why outsiders to science sometimes think science is kind of just self-indulgent. Okay, so I channeled my mind. So my father was a physicist, worked with Felix Bloch, and did work on the magnetic resonance, okay, of the hydrogen atom. I can tell you, Felix was not like an exploring type guy. Okay, he's a Swiss-German scientist, pretty focused and directed. People outside physics might say, "Oh, gee, that's kind of self-indulgent. Who cares?" And it turns out down the road, there's magnetic resonance we use in the diagnostic imaging. But my point here is, they had a very focused goal. People outside that community may not have cared about that goal. Okay, and we could debate that goal, but my point is that in their mind, they were not exploring this. They were climbing a gradient they cared about, maybe other people did or did not care about. But it wasn't whimsical kind of search. It was just a different gradient and kind of objective function that they had. And I think that's partly where some of the discourse or kind of misunderstandings can happen at a broader level. So, within firms, we pitch this as a kind of way to help understand corporate entrepreneurship. And you're this corporate entrepreneur, you're trying to push off in this different dimension. So, for instance, Robert Bergelman, a collaborator, attenders from way back. So Robert did some wonderful stuff about Intel and their early efforts, and he looked at some of the corporate entrepreneurship around developing risk-based computing. And the Intel people said, we don't like that. We're CIS crowd, not RISC. And what they did is, okay, but we really think this is important. We think servers are going to come along that are going to want this. So their clever workaround, the managers in that effort said, it's not RISC. This is actually just a coprocessor. They'll make yours even sparkier. Okay, so they cast a shadow on what Intel actually already cared about to provide resources, because Intel wasn't going to buy into in their heart of hearts, true vision of where this directive should go. So that's this kind of issue. Another way to validate is people think it's crazy and you actually make money off of it. The world's told you it's a good thing. Can you take it to the market? But again, I just want to point out that it's a different kind of exploration. I think that in some important ways is really just fundamentally different from going off to a new technology or something, this other gradient of performance. Okay, so truly the last slide now is this is all kind of a bit of bits and pieces of a broader effort of mine and a sort of sensibility is this being a little playful here, this quote, intelligent design emergence, right? So we have two big ideas about why the world is the way it is. Some godlike notion and some Darwinian type notion. And I guess the suggestion I'm trying to offer is, a kind of engineering, a bit of a synthesis of the engineering, modest engineering of the evolution dynamics. And some points about how you could do it. Now that's not controlling a system, but it's creating contexts in which maybe on average better things might happen. And if I wasn't jetting around and doing these things, these Oxford Press things, I'm putting together a book along this lines. I worry about the organization level. You prefigured early on. Other social systems have to worry about it. A university has to worry about it. A society has to worry about these same kinds of issues about, and I think this is also, where, there was a point and there was concerns where it seems like, okay, government shouldn't make bets. Government shouldn't make bets on a particular technology, how we're going to deal with particular solutions to global climate change. But broader social systems can make choices and design contexts which will be more or less facilitating to solutions that might emerge. So I think kind of at various levels, these kinds of issues, I think, might play out. So thank you, and open. Like we have maybe a minute if you want to have a question.
My name is Eric Bach. I thank you so much for your presentation. Very interesting. You mentioned right at the end climate change. So, de-investment in fossil fuels, a Schumpeterian creative destruction. How can you say something more about what we should look towards? Can you give some good advice for people who worry about our future?
So I can give some modest, maybe they're sort of self-evident kind of suggestions, but it seems to me. So if you think about to the myopia point, clearly in a market economy currently, what are the payoffs to being a firm that is being more or less farsighted or myopic in this regard? All the incentives are for myopia. So I as a firm, a rational firm may understand the consequences 20, 30 years out, but my financial payoffs are not going to be aligned in ways that are going to kind of lead me to make, in some sense, progressive kinds of choices. And so, the absent some pricing, so this is the economist in me, obviously, so that's obvious, people understand that issue. And I guess I would say, back to the sort of agnostic pricing is to try to price consequences and not affirmatively price solutions. But the affirmative part, though, is, how did, and I'm going to wander all over. If we think back to George's comment about, so military needs driving some important technological innovations, we see the birth of general purpose technologies. Really, there are some general purpose problems, okay, battery storage, and kind of a critical, it can scale in different ways. And certainly, if you want really basic research, governments have to support it. So there are various ventures, actually Berkeley tied one, I think, doing some interesting stuff. But just as we've had from the healthcare side and others, I think in some of the sort of upstream, fairly basic sciences, clearly important work is going to needs to be supported, at least in the U.S. context. I don't think we're really doing I don't think it's a big piece of kind of the R&D budget. But I think among the various ways it's incredibly scary is the incredible misalignment between even medium-term corporate kinds of incentives and the social incentives.
Yeah, so that's why we need a different culture. The political culture. The U.S. is not very beneficial to a major new social change and technological change.
Right, and there's the obvious issues of commons problems in some sense in this regard, and kind of that it has to be collected. There's a tragic commons issue, and
So Dan, if I may,
George,
before coming to you, George, I'll come to you in a second. Let me just add, you're not emphasizing enough your own talk and the links to climate change. If you add beyond societal level, multiple societies and the whole global ecology, which is a complex, even more complex, very, very nested hierarchical levels, on one side, climate change is actually a very important example of emergence at the most macro level. And the other side, I just emphasize that these are nested hierarchies, and we are intervening in one part of the system. The interventions are really required at a much more massive level. That's a link straight back to the core of what you've been talking about.
it's kind of interesting. Niche construction. It makes me a kind of tongue-in-cheek comment I'll make. So Marx might have been, wrong about kind of the demise of capitalism through the argument he was making, but in some sense, a capitalist system may create a niche that makes human life problematic for other reasons. But,
George.
To answer sort of more directly your question to begin with, so a year ago here in Hong Kong, we ran a symposium, a study on this kind of stuff and brought stuff in. But one of the things we studied was what companies could do, and what's the environment and economic situation. And one of the places was the Hong Kong transportation system, particularly the Hong Kong bus. And what you find there is very typical. What you find there, if you go to look to try and make the climate change impact of the transportation system much lower, you will find that there's like 7 or 8 things the company could do, and that would reduce the carbon emission and the whatever, it's very substantially. And if you look, 2 of them are an immediate gain. Actually, the company should have thought to do them earlier because they actually come out ahead. There's another couple that are longer-term gains, and then there's some that just are going to cost money and provide no gain to the company. So the company is very interested in making the first 2 because it's immediate return. Some interested in making the next couple and not interested in making the others. Now you can say that's really bad, right? And in some sense it is bad, but in the other sense it's good because what we were aiming for was for the world to recognize climate change is really serious and try and slow things down and hold it off until we can get more serious and actually figure a way to change the economic structure so that you have more incentives to do that kind of a situation. But it requires you're talking about culture changing. It's more than that. You require a law change. Our friends who are economics people, the laws that got passed treat nature as an infinite reservoir. Right. I mean, if you just look at the basic laws, they're an infinite reservoir. If you're say a country in Europe like Hungary, and your neighbors to the west of you are polluting terribly, and the pollution has come flowing. The airflow is from the west to the east. You have no way to sue.
Right.
You have no way to sue those countries because there's no international law that says they can't dump pollution at your border and have it sweep into your country. The laws are not the laws of economics, the way economists practice it, and the legal laws are set that they just don't have the structure either to price do what you say do the price control. If your nature is for free, damaging nature is for free. Right? I mean, you don't have a price controls unless you get the laws changed.
Right, so it's a property right. So I was talking about the affirmative side of patent rights giving you appropriability. Here's the sort of the flip. It's all your first two comments are interesting, though. They're the first about those first two types. It reminds me, there was some interesting work a while back. So at a time when the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency started getting concerned about water pollution, in fact, exactly as you say it in the context of the climate change, some firms discovered actually by once they had to become more mindful about these effluents, they actually changed their production processes and actually lowered costs and reduced effluents. So there are in some cases some of these kinds of win-wins as it were. But I think, and also I think from a technological point of view, you're looking for both specialized markets where it's both easiest and most important, right? So, some of the people about using the battery technology for cars, a country like Israel, Denmark, small, geographically contained, it's easier to solve. So you're looking for situations where that new technology can most readily find a home. Hope you can get the cost down through those experiences and to scale up. So you're kind of, are there some particular opportunity structures? But fundamentally, without some degree of enlightened collective governance, it is very daunting in the absence of some price.
It's a very important point connected to global climate change, and the costs are actually not being fully borne by those that create the costs, and the costs are going to someone else, and externalities, the negative externalities kind of point. JT? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we have time for maybe 3 more questions. So JT, then you're next, and Sam, you're last. Go ahead, JT.
Dan, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. We really enjoy it. So I want to come back to the article on the myopia of learning, right? Mm-hmm. It's truly a classic article. We actually enjoy it. So my question is really, what solutions have research has developed since that publication of that article of how firms, managers can deal with this myopia in learning?
Yeah, so I don't know whether I clean solutions, but I think a kind of interest of mine that I think at least imperfectly speaks of that, back to this issue of kind of interim feedback and reward structures. So I've been interested so John Holland did some interesting work on called credit assignment. So if you think about, he was an early pioneer now, or some of the early work on machine learning and computer science. So in the early days of computer science, chess was even too hard. Forget Go. They were playing checkers. Okay. And this guy Samuels is at IBM trying to teach the computer, how do you do a good checker game? And the feedback of win, lose, or draw is both distant in time, and it's very hard to show a relationship between win, lose, or draw and the particular moves you made within a game. And so Samuels created an initial kind of crude effort of credit assignment where moves that led to good moves got rewards, and it would backward cascade. And so it's kind of I don't know, if those of you who are interested in computer science, Bartow and Sutton have kind of have this sort of classic modern text on this sort of element of machine learning. I think organizations, in some ways you have milestones and so on, need to create better mechanisms of credit assignments to provide positive feedback to these efforts that are not going to create money in the world. They are more distant in time and space. And so, certainly, the idea of milestones is present and so on, but I think we may be under-attended to that. And I do think there's some, for me as a theorist, some interesting ways in which the work of machine learning and credit assignment, and basically what it revolves around in some ways is you're also basically creating your theories of the world. So instead of waiting for nature to give you feedback or the commercial market, you're developing a mental model of what a path to success looks like. Now, it's going to be limited, it's going to be wrong, but at least it creates the potential to reinforce initiatives that a kind of purely nature-type feedback would not reinforce. So I don't have a crisp, but for me it's a kind of interesting, I'm a slow learner, active kind of interest in agenda. But I think at least conceptually that sort of sets up the kind of apparatus one.
Pat Kuhn from School of Business. So increasingly companies are going outside their organizational boundaries to look for solutions to their problems, right? So if you think of Jefferson's and Mahani's paper in organization science, where they look at incentives as a great example.
Yeah.
So there are two parts to my question. So firstly, how important do you think the crowd will be as an actor in this innovation, exploration, exploitation aspect, right? And the second part of the question is, how do you think this will affect the models that you presented earlier, the triangles, right? Where does a crowd fit in? How will it reshape the triangles that you have shown to us?
Right. I think it's a really interesting point, and I think you're very on target. So I think in some ways it's very consonant with the triangle that that's part of the context, right? That is the ecosystem. This is the soup in which the actors are operating. I guess I would also channel another line of old work of mine on absorbed capacity and note, I think I think these broader open systems of innovation are really important, interesting phenomenon. But I think we also have to recognize innovation is not like how a financial market works, that if you're the firm kind of either trying to articulate what your problem is or bringing things back, and in turn bringing things back in, I think in some ways in that discussion we may have, people cite it a lot, but we have to kind of remember that absorbed capacity kind of consideration, okay, that what's the viscosity of knowledge and how this works. And I think so in some contexts, it's pretty straightforward engineering. So Netflix puts out a prize and says, we'll give $1 million to whatever team can create an algorithm that does better at predicting preferences than our current algorithm. And people around the globe work really hard. They don't pay attention to their day job, and they kind of do this. And it's a very powerful mechanism. But that also has the beauty of a well-posed engineering problem. I was talking to a guy who kind of was doing something like this with the Norwegian state oil enterprise, Statoil. They had a kind of material handling problem, and they really struggled with the way to articulate in a way that kind of appropriate technologists would kind of understand, and their solutions would really speak to their problem. So I think it is very consonant with, and kind of, I think it's in the spirit of the broader ecosystem being the context and not the focal traditional enterprise. But let's also remember some of the challenges that focal enterprise will have to ultimately make that system work. But I think it's a great pushing out of those kind of ideas.
Sam
from Department of Management. Two questions. So one, you talked about the general purpose technologies and as a source of maybe innovation. In today's world, we have apps, which are very specific purpose technologies, and they have ambition of doing something big. So Uber started with taxis, but it's talking about sort of becoming the logistic infrastructure of urban centers. So one, do you see examples of that happening, so from very specific to general purpose? And second, in your view, what's the role of social construction, political push, industrial policies for that push certain kind of technology or there's just a technology innovation?
So on the first one, there's sort of capital G general purpose technologies, computation. There's sort of lowercase general purpose technology, here's a platform and so on, and here's the either the Android or Apple and so on. And so, and then I think you can even get to a kind of, even below that in some sense is a kind of classic issue of firm diversification and leveraging of capabilities. So that's kind of, So capabilities have a certain fungibility and applicability. So once Uber's developed this system, they can offer new products and systems and so on. So I think it's important as you're to think about it at all those levels. There's sort of these kind of enormous fundamental changes. But I also want to note some of those often cases, not always, those fundamental changes occurred addressing a very, very specific need. And then it turned out, oh my God, not only boring for the military's rifles, turns out actually lots of things need to be machined with precision. And similarly solving the military's problem with the artillery. So, but I think it's important to kind of nest those. These very big G ones, a kind of meso G that are kind of these robust, broader platforms, and then a kind of, in some sense, more classic business strategy proliferation. I mean, per the second broad issue, and back to this kind of broader social policy, which, well, the social construction, but then it kind of became more of the, is clearly, the broader background context, government-supported fundamental science has been kind of a seed cord throughout those kinds of efforts. And I guess as George has noted that, these unintended byproducts, okay, the U.S. didn't go to put a man on the moon to solve the linearization problem and certain advances in computers, but it was a byproduct. Reagan's idea of Star Wars and lasers pushed lasers a little bit. There weren't so many byproducts on that. But those are either sort of happy or less happy instances. Certainly, it seems to me it's the kind of, back to the role of government to do things that are more basic and potentially more generative. And again, it's ex ante, hard to predict how generative, and whether it's but I think you can kind of identify some of those sort of at least modest case G type general kinds of efforts for which there's productive goods problems on who's going to do it. They're too distant from commercialization for a modern firm. And again, when we had monopolies, Xerox could create Xerox PARC. AT&T could create Bell Labs in ways that are perhaps healthy. I don't think one is hard-pressed to identify existing corporations that have such a secure quasi-monopoly that they're willing to throw research into that kind of fundamental science that those two entities did. And so there is a kind of default for some government and university-based feeding into that.
By the way, this was not directly Ronald Reagan and the Strategic Defense Initiative, but all the military satellites up in the sky did lead to GPS.
Yeah.
And
that's right. It's a nice example, right? Of kind of they were
wasn't
solving
planned
their
that
problem.
way.
They weren't solving like how do I find the right restaurant in Hong Kong.
That's exactly
That wasn't
right.
in their
And now,
mind. It turned out to be a
now
nice
it's on your
byproduct.
phone. Google Maps works on GPS.
Right.
Dan, I must say it's wonderful to have you here and to hear you speak about your ideas and very nicely weave strands of work that you've been doing over the last several decades, and also provide us exactly this magisterial survey of the innovation and technology and adaptation landscape. It's great to have you here. I understand you're heading back to the U.S. tomorrow. And please give him a very warm round of applause.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Sarah.